Hi, this is The Taiwan Take by Ghost Island Media. I'm your host, Emily Waiwu. Today, our guest is an election observer who has worked on more than 50 elections around the world. Ben Graham-Jones has a new report on Taiwan's presidential elections that took place in January 2024. Titled Taiwan POWER, the report sets up Taiwan as a model for the world for resilience against foreign information manipulation and interference. 2024 has been a year of elections. And as policymakers worldwide are taking steps to protect and prepare their societies against such digital threats, Jones believes that lessons learned here in Taiwan can be applied. Here at Ghost Island Media, we have been tracking disinformation in Taiwan's elections, including our conversations with INDSR, the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, Doublethink Lab, Taiwan Fact Check Center, and the Citizen Lab in Toronto. I'll have links to all of those episodes for you in the show notes. And for now, my conversation with Ben Graham-Jones. His report was commissioned by Doublethink Lab. It was released in August 2024. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Pleasure to be with you, Emily.
Before we dive into the report, I want to talk about this definition, FIMI, foreign information manipulation and interference. So walk us through the changes of that language.
Will do, Emily. So first, I think it's really important that we remember that the most important thing in this whole domain, we can sometimes spend so long thinking about language, but the most important thing is action and what we actually do to counter the different harms that we define. If we go back to the days of fake news, that was the point where the discussion really was pretty undeveloped. And over time, we started to come up with a more precise vocabulary to talk about the different forms of what we might call information disorder. Information which is spread and which sometimes intends to and sometimes doesn't intend to, but has the consequence of confusing or eroding democratic polities. So we ended up defining sort of three, the Council of Europe initially defined three different forms of information disorder. Okay, they had misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Now, misinformation was not intentional. Disinformation was intentional. Okay, but both of those were wrong. And malinformation is based on truth, or even true, or has some granularity of truth in there, but is misleading. But what that didn't speak to was the efforts and the increasing efforts of foreign autocratic states to interfere in democratic processes. Now, a key part of democratic processes is that you need to have access to information. And so there was a gap in the market there. There was a concept that we knew existed. We could see it happening in elections. We could see it happening outside of elections throughout the democratic process. But there wasn't a way in which it could be defined. And so really, civil society organizations in Europe and the European Commission sort of came together to try and advance a framework for understanding what these types of threats were. And they ended up defining FIMI as follows: as a non-illegal pattern of behavior that threatens to or has the potential to negatively impact values, procedures, and political processes. They noted that the activity is manipulative in character and it's conducted in an intentional and coordinated manner. Now, I think it really captures some of the things that we've seen in recent elections.
Let's talk about intention. In deciding to research the case of Taiwan, what drew you to this particular election?
Well, I think what's interesting about Taiwan is we often consider Taiwan to be patient zero of Chinese information operations, Beijing's information operations. And what that basically means is that Taiwan, being such a high priority for Beijing, often receives tactics and receives information operations are sometimes later rolled out to other places. So that, I think, is one reason why Taiwan is interesting. Taiwan is also interesting because it's such a hotbed of innovation. What you see in Taiwan is a plethora of civil society organizations, including Doublethink Lab, but also a wide range of others. Taiwan Fact Check Center, MyGoPen, Kofax, there's so many doing fantastic work. If we are to move from not just defining the problem, but also defining the solution, I think Taiwan is a place that provides a good deal of inspiration to the wider world. And that's not just confined to the online space. So I'll give you an example of that. One of the tactics that's long been used to influence and to manipulate within Taiwan has been the use of tours, whereby Taiwanese community leaders or journalists will be invited to the PRC, sometimes under the banner of a cultural exchange. And these tours are very carefully designed in order to influence the participants, who will then come back, or they hope that will come back with a more positive view about the PRC. And we now see this being rolled out right across the globe, right across the global south in particular, in order to influence societies across the world.
Now let's dive into your current report. But first, tell us about the process, your methodology.
Sure. So the approach we took to this comes from sort of three sources, right? It's desk research, it's from a review of the great work, including surveys that Doublethink Lab themselves have done, and it came from a program of interviews with stakeholders across Taiwan. By looking at Taiwan's strengths and Taiwan's weaknesses, we would end up with insights which demonstrated both perhaps what best practice looks like, but also about here is a society who has faced considerable information operations, who's faced FIMI for a very long time. And if it still shows some weaknesses, that should be cause for concern. And that should be something that the rest of the world should take note of. And we thought about, okay, what are those key characteristics? What are the key aspects of Taiwan's resilience that we can define? And that was how we approached it. And it will always be the case of when you're drawing conclusions about something as big as the overall resilience of a country, there's always going to be disagreements about that. But that's what we want. We want that this is something that will launch a conversation about what resilience to FIMI looks like. So the ultimate aim here is a menu of resilience. It's a menu of resilience for people across the globe. And we hope that over the years to come, the global democratic community will be able to look at the Taiwan model, at the Ukraine model, at the Georgia model, and in doing so, be able to draw inspiration for their own counter-FIMI resilience.
So earlier this year, there was another report by the Canadian Institute, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. They looked at learning specifically for Canada. But you're trying to put together a model for the world. How does that change the scope of which you are observing and commenting on?
Sure. So what we're not doing is saying that this is a model that the whole world should follow. Far from it, right? What we're defining, it's not a model of something to do. It's a model of something that is. Okay, it's descriptive. It says, here is the situation in Taiwan. The resilience that's developed looks like this. So, for example, one of the aspects of Taiwanese resilience is purpose. Mm-hmm. One of the things that you find within Taiwan, and when you speak to civil society organizations, when you speak to people working against FIMI in Taiwan, is this great united sense of purpose. And it sort of grew out, I think, part of it grew out of the sunflower movement, and then the subsequent experience of seeing the repression of the protests in Hong Kong. And then you're reading about all of the human rights violations against the Uyghurs and seeing the direct impact of FIMI then on Taiwanese elections. And these sort of collective shared experience, something that really comes through when you speak to people leading these organizations. So if you're in another country trying to work out how to foster FIMI resilience, you might look at that shared sense of purpose that's described in the Taiwan model and think, how can we speak to people's hearts in our country in order to generate that collective sense of strategy, rather than just thinking about institutional reform. So that's one example about how we hope that this will be useful for people across the globe.
Let's talk about the 5 prongs that you identified. This is a 5-letter acronym, POWER. You started with purpose. Purpose is the P of the power that you talked about. This purpose-driven, organic. Let's work down the list.
Cool. Okay. So let's have a look at what do we mean by organic. What we're not saying is that government doesn't play a role in Taiwan. Government plays 2 roles. It provides funding for a healthy civil society and for healthy actors, for actors who operate across the counter-FIMI ecosystem. And secondly, it points at things. Okay, it says this is a problem. Okay, or hey, have a look at this. This is an issue. It identifies when there's particular FIMI campaigns. For example, the Size Secret History disinformation campaign. during the Taiwan election, which was a book containing all sorts of lies about the incumbent president at the time, the outgoing president. It can point at those things and flag them. So that's really the role of government in Taiwan. But the counter-FIMI resilience is not led exclusively by the government, right? It's something that comes from the bottom up. It comes from a raft of organizations, lots of actors who are not enormous institutes, but who nonetheless are groups of committed people taking from the bottom up a sense of initiative towards a shared purpose. And that is the organic character of the resilience that we saw in Taiwan.
Your next word, whole society, your next letter.
Yeah, so what we see in Taiwan, okay, so the way that we have conceptualized the Taiwan Power, right, is through an umbrella. Okay, and it's the idea that you've got a group of people sharing that united purpose, putting up an umbrella to shield themselves against a storm. Okay, and that's the sort of image we've used to communicate this. But if you have a look under the umbrella, you see such a diversity of people. And these came through in the interviews we did. You see older people who've set up initiatives or who are contributing or who are raising the alarm on aspects of FIMI. You see LGBT groups, you see women, you see men, you see a huge raft of all the diversity you can imagine encapsulated under that umbrella. And that sort of whole society response. But it's also whole society in terms of the initiatives. There's a hugely diverse range of counter-FIMI initiatives which are rolled out in Taiwan. And that isn't just to say that this is absolutely perfect. And what the report underscores is that there's also areas where that resilience may not be whole society enough. So there's areas where, for example, the funding of temples within Taiwan. There's areas where that counter-FIMI resilience could be broadened. But that's what we mean when we describe the resilience as generally whole society in its nature.
What were some of the offline resilience that you observed?
So for Taiwan specifically, online means are easier, right? That's why I mentioned the tours, is because they are something which has sort of circumvented that they have become, or at least your interlocutors repeatedly advise that they've become so ingrained within so many Taiwanese communities, and understandably, it's quite difficult to combat as a tactic, right? I mean, who doesn't want a subsidized holiday, right? So if someone says to me, I can go to Spain for a week and they're going to pay for it, well, fantastic, sign me up. So you can understand if somebody comes and says, well, actually, this is a technique of democratic interference. For the average person, people are not necessarily going to be persuaded, perhaps, by that argument. I think what it does is it underscores just how the level of resources which are going into this. And to the extent that you'll have rather sort of senior officers or relatively high-level officers in the PRC, which roll out these operations within smaller areas within, or municipalities within Taiwan. So you can see the sort of the disparity of resources.
Were you able to identify more sources of these interference coming from the PRC, particular maybe branches of the government or particular offices that you hadn't known about previously?
So the overall institutional superstructure is quite well understood. The network of organizations around the United Front Work Department is quite well documented. I think what's interesting in the evolution of FIMI is how entrepreneurial a lot of this has become. In some senses, the actual FIMI effort itself has become a lot more whole society. You have different officers within the PRC that compete to do a better job or compete for limited resources. And then you have your online influencers too, who also want to seek favor and to have pro-PRC accounts spread their content, and so who will put out certain narratives. One of the changes that Doublethink Lab actually noted in this election, right, is a much higher, a far more sort of horizontal playing field, in the sense that you're having a lot of automated or semi-automated accounts, very sort of quantity-focused approach, a very high number of accounts that are being created to spread this stuff. But those influences are still very important, not just within Taiwan, but actually elsewhere as well.
You mentioned really briefly United Front, which is a core strategy from the PRC which historically focused primarily on issues like Taiwan, Tibet, Uyghurs, and Hong Kong. How has it evolved now in a sense that you just said that China's FIMI is a lot more comprehensive. Can we understand that as all of it being united front, or?
It's difficult at an operational level sometimes to distinguish united front efforts to genuine opinion. And that reflects its success, right? Is that this stuff has often been whitewashed into the information ecosystem. And in a democracy, of course, someone's opinion, a legitimate opinion, is a legitimate opinion. Even if that opinion has its sources or has its origins in influence operations, right? Once a democratic citizen holds that opinion, you can't turn up and just say, well, hey, your opinion's no good. Their vote counts as much as someone else's. So united front efforts have achieved success in that regard, and that poses very tangible problems for actually analyzing this stuff. Now, broadly, thinking about how united front work has changed, I think that there's a number of dynamics. I mean, one is that they have become a lot more ambitious. As you rightly said, Emily, historically it focused on this sort of relatively small set of issues. But what we now see are these far-reaching attempts to influence societies across the globe, often coupled with efforts to not just herald the success of the PRC model, but also to show that your democracy doesn't need to be the only game in town, or at least democracy as it's understood in much of the world. We've also seen increasing integration with Russian information operations. There's been a lot that has been learned, I think, by the PRC from how Russia has rolled out operations. I mean, Russia's been a lot more ambitious in terms of the localization of its operations, often looking to influence specific elections at a high level of granularity, right? That's well documented. And whereas the PRC historically was a lot more about promoting these PRC narratives on that small subset of issues. I think we're starting to see that change now, not just in Taiwan, where that change is long established, but actually across the globe. The PRC is showing a lot more ambition in how it is promoting its narratives. And it's cause for concern. There should be cause for concern for Democrats across the globe, because when we're talking about this greater ambition, that's your societies, that's your democracies we're talking about. So it alarms me when I speak to senior policymakers across the globe, and I speak to civil society organizations across the globe, and you see that actually huge numbers of highly influential people have no idea what United Front is. They've never heard of United Front strategy. They don't know what it is. They don't know what its TTPs are, and that's a problem.
Let's move to the fourth letter of your power paradigm, evolving.
So evolving, what we see in Taiwan is there's a real spirit of innovation that has driven the continual modernization of resilience. So if we take MicroPen, for example, I think they were founded in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, at which time they were looking at manipulated images and this sort of thing. Okay, as time goes on, they have to start looking at cheap fakes and manipulated videos. You look at what they're doing now. They're using 5 different types of software in order to verify whether or not manipulated video has indeed been manipulated. So you see this continual need for evolution in the approaches that these organizations have taken, which goes in parallel with the evolution of the tactics that are used to manipulate information. And that's a great thing, right? We need to be forward thinking. We need to get one step ahead of those who are trying to undermine and manipulate our democracies. So it's one of the most positive aspects of what we see in Taiwan. And I think it's important that that's described within the Taiwan Power model, because actually when we look at across the world, we quite often see that those mechanisms are just not there. One of the positive developments we've seen globally is the evolving character of that resilience is taking place at a global level, right? We have things like the disarm framework, for example, which provides a means of categorizing FIMI incidents, which is you can roll that out in lots of different countries and then secure sort of global insight onto how these things are rolled out. We've got great means of collaborating around fact-checking, the International Fact-Checking Network. We've got great conferences like China in the World, Doublethink Labs flagship conference, which brings together practitioners to better understand FIMI. So at a global level, those mechanisms are being developed, but within specific countries, there's often a long way to go. So when policymakers are looking over at Taiwan and thinking about what they might learn from the Taiwanese experience, I think that the evolving character of Taiwanese FIMI resilience is incredibly important.
You are calling attention to the speed in which the civic societies are adapting. So, which means the speed of the FIMI is fast as well, coming from the foreign actors. How fast are we talking? How fast are the foreign interference methods or mechanisms? How fast is it changing?
It's changing faster than the election cycle. If you imagine the election cycle, elections in Taiwan's every 2 years, most countries once every 4 years or every 5 years. And so the problem with that is that if you're in one country and you're looking at your previous election, what were the lessons learned from the previous vote? And that's a big issue because that information is out of date by the time your election takes place. And so that's the thing with counter-FIMI resilience, right? Is that it needs to evolve, but it needs to actually evolve quicker than your own country's democratic system, right? And that's why we believe that international collaboration, international conversations, looking at other countries' recent elections and how FIMI has transpired therein is vitally important for building that counter-FIMI capacity across the planet.
Before we take a break, let's talk about some of the cautionary tales as well you have for Taiwan's vulnerabilities. What are some of the things that you pointed out that are the most urgent?
Well, I think one of the aspects which really came through was this idea of a strategic vision for Taiwanese counter-FIMI resilience in 5 years, in 10 years. It was quite striking, and I guess we could understand why, but it was quite striking that people would often talk about the future in terms of, well, if the PRC does this, if the PRC does that, and you can totally understand why, right? Because of the nature of the power dynamic. But we also felt that it was important, like in any other major resilience building operation, to have a collective plan that draws people in, that people have got buy-in to about where that resilience should be in 5, 10, 20 years. And that sort of long-term planning, I think, is taking place on an organizational level, but not necessarily between organizations. And that's an area where we felt that this is almost about making that whole society approach even more whole society. A second is international collaboration, and that's an area where there's already been so many great steps forward that have been taken. Now, there's two aspects to that. One is continuing to make sure that Taiwanese expertise feeds into other countries' resilience, and that's what we're trying to do here. But the second aspect to that, and this really is perhaps where I think a number of us felt that there was room for improvement, is combating PRC FIMI against Taiwan in other countries. So actually a lot of that FIMI which targets Taiwan is actually taking place elsewhere. If you are in a third country, it's actually pretty unlikely if Taiwan's being critiqued or attacked. It's very rare that a spokesperson pops up on the TV with a local accent defending the Taiwanese position and articulating things using those local metaphors, drawing on the way in which you can convey a message to a population in country. And that sort of ambassadorial network of sort of like-minded partners of Taiwan across the globe, that's something that might be able to help communicate Taiwan's perspective a bit more powerfully.
Strategic vision, international collaborations. I love everything you just outlined. Well, let's take a short break. And when we come back, I want to switch gear for a little bit. I've loved nerding out on Taiwanese elections so far, but I want to ask you about your past experience observing other elections from around the world.
Sounds good, Emily.
Hey, if you have enjoyed the Taiwan Take and would like to support Ghost Island Media, we take monthly donations on Patreon. We're at patreon.com/Taiwan. And please give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This helps other people find the show. All right, thank you. And back to the show. Welcome back to the Taiwan Take. We've been speaking to Ben Graham-Jones, an international election consultant who has worked in 50 elections around the world. Ben, let's turn the chapter to your career. You've studied elections in Zambia, in Gambia, in Palestine, Kenya, Ukraine, South Africa, and now Taiwan. You actually started your career at a development NGO in Congo. How has starting in Africa shaped your approach later on as an election observer?
So that experience in the DRC was quite something. So I was still a student at the time, and I'd raised the money to go out and contribute to the work of a tiny, tiny little organization I just found on Google. And I thought, wow, this is really, how can I sort of study this stuff, discuss this stuff, and not actually have spent time there? It seemed to me to be just innately hypocritical. And so I went out to a village. I lived in a little shed, basically no water, no electricity. If I wanted to wash, I had to go and jump into Lake Tanganyika to do so. And that was how I spent my summer. But, if you want to learn about something, go and speak to the people who are there on the ground, look at things through best as you can through their eyes. All of these elections are around conflict, about empathy, they're about community. They're about those connections between people. They're about people's thoughts and feelings about the next generation and their futures. And I don't really think you can get a sense of that unless you're on the ground speaking to people. And that approach really is what I've taken forward with me across my career as I've tried to understand the different objects of study.
Which came first? Did Africa come first, or was it that you wanted to study elections and then you went to Africa?
Well, I knew my values, I guess. I believe that we all have a right to democracy. You'll get people who go, okay, well, democracy works in this place, but it doesn't work in that place. Okay, you hear that view. Democracy is good for some countries, but not for others. But I don't agree with that. I think that, we can't say we believe in universal human rights and then say, well, actually, democracy is just for some people, just for others. No, we all have the right to our own freedom. And so I knew what my values were, but I wasn't sure if I knew exactly how I wanted to channel that. But the more that I guess, got to know different societies and met people across the globe, the more you saw the underlying similarities, right? We all have our cultural differences and differences in perspective, but you see that fundamentally there is so much that unites us. And I do think we've got so much to learn from each other. One of the things that we see, go back to the first part of our discussion about FIMI, we see how these tactics are often deployed across different countries. It's similar for all aspects of election resilience, right? Different election systems can also learn from one another. If you want to improve voter turnout, you can learn from what other countries. So for me, it's always been, I've operated in this unique niche where, every year I probably see more elections than just about anyone else on the planet, except maybe journalists firsthand. But in doing so, you realize that is the natural domain of operation for someone who makes contribution to democracy.
Has there been the Pacific election that stands out to you in terms of the barriers that they faced on the path to a free and fair election?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some dangerous situations. There's been all sorts. But I can tell you one country that I worked in. There was members of the election commission who were complicit in severe irregularities, and I was interviewing some of these people for part of my job, and I knew they were lying. They knew they were lying. Having this conversation, and you're just thinking, how can you put that short-term interest above the underlying good of your people who you're supposed to serve? So that was in one country, but then you also see you have moments where you speak to people who've put themselves at immense risk in order to narrate a situation that they've been in, or because they want the international community to be aware of something. And those are inspiring for your sense of why you do your job, right? So this is at the other end of the spectrum. And you leave with just such huge admiration for some of those people. So you really see all sorts. It's like life, right? You get people who behave in good ways, people who behave in bad ways. You get people who've made decisions to try and push things forward, but have to compromise and be pragmatic because of the nature of their role. So you see a bit of everything. But in doing so, I think what it leaves you with is a sense of our common humanity.
Let's talk about some of that, the election mechanisms. So in Taiwan, the votes are counted by hand. And it's open to the public to observe. It's great. And this ensures that there's transparency. It prevents voter fraud. And you have a story from Gambia that's in a really similar matter.
Yeah, well, in the Gambia, they vote using marbles. So people go into the polling station, they drop the marble and they earn which fits the candidate they want to vote for. And there's been different people who have not really listened to Gambians in the past say, hey, this doesn't align with global democratic best practice and these things. But actually, if you speak to the Gambians, they love it. They're so proud of this. They've got an organization that has a fantastic app called Marble, gives you all the different election information. And so, that's their democracy, right? That's how they've understood it and that's how they want to take it forward. And there we go. That's how it should be. It's those sorts of things that remind you that, hey, we all have those same rights and those same values. The way that we put them into practice, it can be very different.
Voting by marbles. Is it still the case now?
Yeah.
Okay, well, on the flip side of that, so in 2022, you were in Kenya, and that was when they implemented biometric fingerprinting technology for voting. Can you tell us what you saw there?
So just casting my mind back to the Kenyan election. So they had a technology that they rolled out, and it meant that the votes that had been filled in, the sort of official voting forms, right, the legally binding tabulation forms, I should say, of when all the votes had been counted within the polling station. The legally binding copies were the paper versions, but they took photos on these devices, and the photos of these forms were then uploaded onto a portal. And it was a very clever move, really, because it meant that if anyone later claimed that these results were not what had been counted at the polling station, someone could just say, well, look at this, check online. It is. It's there. It matches up. And so it enabled disinformation basically to be rebutted before it had emerged. It meant that people weren't able to make the same claims that they might have been able to, rigging or whatever it might have been, simply because they had this system of verifying it. And so it was a good example about how some of the most effective means of protecting election integrity can come from pre-bunking rather than debunking, right? Acting before it's happened rather than after. And by having this mechanism, which provided tools for people to rebut false claims, it played a positive role in the process.
Is there a general observation on which kind of societies are more be able to adapt to digital voting?
Yeah. So you can have technology in different parts of the process, right? The election process. But in terms of the voting itself, most reliable or most democracies which tend to be judged in conformity with global standards use manual processes. Now, there are many countries that do use non-manual processes and use, whether it's electronic voting or voting machines, and these have differential rates of success, and analysts will disagree on some aspects of this. But I would point to, there's actually a great report by National Endowment for Democracy, actually Adam Fivenson over there and some colleagues did a great report recently. There's a good panel discussion you can watch online. And one of the points that they really hit home, okay, so this is something about artificial intelligence, the point that was being made then was the importance of trust, okay, in democratic processes. Why is trust so important? Well, it's important because you can have the best election in the world, but if nobody believes it was a good election, then it may as well have not held it in the first place. So you've got those two aspects to an election. And the problem is that those who produce disinformation find it very easy to produce believable disinformation about election technology. And the reason for that is it's very difficult to verify for an ordinary citizen, not for specialists, but for an ordinary citizen. You can't observe photons, right? So it's extremely difficult for them to secure the sort of tangible evidence that can convince an individual person. Sometimes it can be done, but usually that's quite difficult.
In terms of technology, let's switch to social media. That's also one of your expertise in your election observing. The issue of deep fakes when it comes to artificial intelligence. In your writing about Ukraine recently, you flagged the emergence of video-based information, so-called deep fakes.
So there's lots of things that can be done. And at the basis, sensitization is incredibly important. There is still, in a lot of the countries that I work with, large swathes of people who don't realize that you can make a deep fake. And actually, of course, there's many people in the world who still lack reliable access even to the internet. And so they will still, in their lifetimes, encounter a deepfake for the first time. They've not yet had the same life experience those of us in developed countries will have. So that's a major challenge. There's a lot of discussion that's going on around watermarking, some of which still has the two related challenges, right? Firstly, what if you end up with lots of different watermarking systems? Could that reduce the degree to which people will be able to believe in any one system? And number two, whether that the system itself can be impersonated. So there's a lot of discussion that's going on around that. Where I think that there's some mileage to be done here is looking at the underlying issue, which is something we understand a lot about, which is trust. Thinking about who do people trust, right? Which institutions do people trust? If they don't trust them, why don't they trust them? And working through those avenues where trust exists in a society. So, for example, if you've gone through an election and you've realized that deepfakes and other means of disinformation were targeting, let's say, for example, how to register to vote, right? Let's say the real target was in order to confuse people or make sure that people were not able to register to vote or didn't understand that part of the process. Okay? Hypothetical example. In the next election, what you can do is you can look at who do people trust in the society. Do people trust celebrities, sports stars, influencers, and then mobilize these people to communicate fact-based information about that part of the process. So I think we really need to be thinking about how do people think, how can this information be targeted in order to reach those people, and in doing so, rebut that type of disinformation before it even emerges.
Where do you stand in terms of the responsibility of the platforms?
There's a number of things that are important. One of it is they need to empower others, make sure that researchers have got the access to data that they need, make sure that the what's called the APIs, which is basically it's like a gateway, it's a means by which researchers can secure good data on social media, right? And if they don't have that access, then it really restricts what researchers can do in understanding the spread of content online. And so those sorts of mechanisms are incredibly important. Number two, social platforms really need to make sure that they are, insofar as they take transparency measures, that they are also rolling those out globally. And what we saw, for example, with the ad libraries, which was a means by which the Meta in particular would open up data about spending on advertising on its platform, was that in a much earlier stage, developed countries, European countries, Taiwan, had access to that stuff, to those tools, and had much better access to its features than countries in the global south. And so it's really important that measures are taken around transparency. And by the way, that's also, of course, in the interests of the platforms themselves. They've seen, I think, very clearly that when action is not taken, then what is it that happens? Well, of course, with regulation increase. And so, if you're sat there from a platform's perspective thinking about these things, it's firmly in your interest to take measures to support transparency on your platforms. And there's certainly a lot of people, I think, within some of these platforms who understand that and who are genuinely committed to taking positive steps forward. I think it's for your global civil society to outline really clear pathways and to make clear what we are demanding, because otherwise, I think too much of what we've seen so far has been often acting in not such a coordinated manner. And I think some of the platforms feel that whatever they do, they will always be criticized, which is right. That's also the role of civil society.
On the user side, social media and the internet is a very, very fun place to be. There's still people who are either they are new to internet or they are from a part of the world where internet penetration rate is still on the rise. What can each of us, what do we say to help protect them from digital foreign interference?
I think the sustainable solution to this is equipping people with the tools to protect themselves. And what we first need to understand when we're faced with societies which are still undergoing a digital transition is to understand who is trusted. If you understand who's trusted, then you're able to understand how to combat those which seek to sow distrust. And so if you know that within a society it's the village elder or it's people from who have lived in the city who are now returning to the village, if you know that it's whatever particular type of person it is who is trusted within that area, then that is a really great person who you can work with to support that society. And so if you can then channel education about deepfakes or about fact-checking through that individual, then they will then spread that through to the society. And we also need to understand different trends of information consumption. For example, I've worked in a number of countries where you go out to the villages in Africa, where actually a lot of people are getting their political information from WhatsApp audio messages, which are recorded often by people associated to central campaign teams and then spread through pyramid structures. It means that people are often receiving that content from family and from community members. And that's like the reason why people are trusting the content that they receive. So if you understand how stuff spreads, then that makes it easier as well to take action on things. So all those things matter. And I think once you've got that basis of understanding of how things spread and how what disinformation is, how to fact check, how to verify, you can then start talking about things like FIMI, the United Front and all of those. But before you even get to that point in the discussion, there's the sort of basics which need to be addressed. And I really regret that when I work across so many countries, I see again and again that often the investments just haven't been made in sensitizing rural populations and populations which are lacking internet literacy about the dangers and the harms that await online.
The WhatsApp example you pointed out, it reminds me of the Line scenario in Taiwan, where you have a lot of disinformation and misinformation that are spread through these closed neighborhood, family, co-worker, these closed groups of Line groups, and they are very difficult to detect.
You can't monitor it. And so we need to think about what we can reform, what we can't. And so there's some things where you can get good data, right? There's policy reforms that can be undertaken. But then you've also got things which are literally human psychological dynamics, right? Things like path dependency and cognitive dissonance and groupthink. These are well-documented psychological phenomena which we know are present across all sorts of human societies. So this is not just about internet literacy and teaching people about how information spreads online, but it's also about ensuring that people across the globe have got an understanding of our own weaknesses as human beings. What psychological traps we are vulnerable to. And I think that aspect is often overlooked. You're a great champion for including within national education systems, education about disinformation and how it spreads. But we also need to be teaching people about those cognitive biases so that we can address that part of the dilemma.
When we speak to disinformation experts, at the end of the day, it comes down to media literacy, education, awareness, and just keep hammering down those very basic concepts. It does take courage to speak up in telling somebody, hey, I think let's think twice about this. I think in a society like Taiwan, you don't want to cause trouble. It's a very conformist culture. You have to be very brave to take that step, asking your neighbor. That, I think, is disinformation that has been debunked.
Right.
Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I really enjoy nerding out on elections with you, and I really look forward to reading more of your reports in the future.
Thanks, Emily. It's been a pleasure. All the best.
Ben Graham-Jones, election consultant who just authored the report on the 2024 Taiwanese presidential elections from Doublethink Lab in Taipei. The report is called Taiwan POWER, a model for resilience to foreign information manipulation and interference. We will have a download link in the show notes. And you can follow Ben. Where can we follow Ben?
Yeah, well, you can if you check out benjijones.com. That brings together my work.
benjijones.com. Great. This has been a Ghost Island Media production based in Taipei, Taiwan. This episode was made from help by Jenna Stevenson and Zach Zhang and Wayne Tsai. Thank you for listening. See you next time. Ghost Island Media.